Most rappers only flex guns in music videos. King Von made other rappers cancel plans, just because they heard he was in the same city. His name was Dayvon Bennett, from the streets of Chicago's Block, a drill artist who turned real violence into platinum storytelling. But behind the hits was a reputation so dark that even established rappers spoke about him in quiet, careful tones. NLE Choppa didn't hold back. He looked into the camera and said it plain. He was death, not a persona, not a character for the cameras. Death. So what made the entire rap game actually afraid of King Von? Was it the people he ran with, the bodies the streets whispered about, the way he tweeted like the violence was a public diary, or the fact that the fear didn't die when he did? This is the real story of why rappers were scared of King Von while he was alive, and why some still won't say his name the wrong way even now. Chapter 1. Because the streets already knew his name. Before the platinum plaques, before the music videos, before the world ever heard the name King Von, the streets of Chicago already knew Dayvon Bennett. He was born August 9th, 1994, on the South Side. Most of his life was spent inside Parkway Gardens, a housing complex the world would later call Block. That name alone carried weight. Shootings were normal. Rival sets were close enough to walk to. Survival was not a metaphor. It was the daily schedule. His father, Walter Bennett, was in and out of the system and was killed when Dayvon was only 11. The boy was raised mostly by his mother in an environment where the wrong look, the wrong block, or the wrong association could end a life before it really started. By the time most kids were worrying about grades or sports, he was already moving in the same circles that would define the rest of his short life. At 16, he caught his first serious case, armed robbery. Prosecutors looked at adult time, the kind of numbers that could erase a future. Because of his age, he went through the juvenile system instead. Boot camp, detention. He earned his GED behind those walls. It was the beginning of a pattern. Large stretches of his teenage years disappeared into cells, 14 months, 15 months. The free world only got pieces of him. Then came 2014. That summer, a party in Englewood turned into a crime scene. 19-year-old Malcolm Stuckey, by most accounts not a gang member, a young man working and going to school, was sitting on a porch with others when gunfire erupted. Stuckey was shot in the head and died. 2 other men were wounded. Shell casings littered the ground. Within days, Dayvon Bennett and his associate Michael Big Mike Wade were arrested. Von was charged with first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He was 19 years old, looking at the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. What followed was more than 3 years in Cook County Jail waiting for trial. While he sat, the streets kept moving. Rivals kept score. Friends kept his name alive. One of the people who stayed consistent was Lil Durk, a childhood connection from the same world who was already further along in music. Durk sent support. When the case finally reached its end in December 2017, the charges against Von were dropped. He walked out a free man. That is the part most casual fans miss. King Von did not become dangerous because he got famous. He got famous because the danger was already attached to his name. By the time the industry met him, Block already had stories. The people who moved in those circles already understood the reputation. When Durk signed him to only the family and put him in position, the music did not create the myth. The music simply gave the myth a microphone. And then came Crazy Story. Released in December 2018, the song did not sound like fantasy. It sounded like a man sitting in a room telling you exactly what happened. The setup, the girl, the robbery that went wrong, the shots, the escape, the aftermath. The delivery was calm, detailed, almost conversational. Listeners who knew Chicago drill heard something different from the usual aggression. They heard reportage. Whether every line was literal or heightened for the record, the feeling was the same. This did not sound like a character. It sounded like someone who had already lived the chapters he was selling. That is why the fear started early. Rappers and street figures did not look at King Von and see a new artist who might one day become a problem. They saw someone whose name had already circulated in the same conversations as real bodies in real cases long before the first music video dropped. The hits only made the name louder. The reputation had been building in the dark for years. Fame did not invent King Von. It just turned the lights on. Chapter 2. T. Roy and the Rule of Who You Move With. If King Von was the name that made people nervous, T. Roy was one of the reasons why. James T. Roy Johnson stood around 5'1". In almost any other context, that height would be a punchline. On the south side of Chicago, it became part of the legend. The streets did not measure him by size, they measured him by what people said he was willing to do. He was Black Disciples' Block, and for years he moved as King Von's closest partner, the friend who was there before the music, before the cameras, before the industry ever learned the name. In the drill world, association is never neutral. You are judged by the people standing next to you. Von did not just have a reputation of his own. He had a best friend whose name already carried weight in the same circles. When Chief Keef put T. Roy in songs, lines about him grabbing the strap and being ready to send someone to heaven, it was not random name-dropping. It was confirmation from one of the biggest voices in the culture that this short, quiet figure was considered dangerous enough to mention on record. That created a simple, brutal equation for anyone watching from the outside. If you had a problem with Von, you were not only dealing with one man who had already beaten a murder case. You were dealing with the understanding that people around him, especially the ones like T. Roy, were described as the ones who actually handled the dirt. Security for a famous rapper is one thing. A childhood friend with a street reputation is something else entirely. One can be paid to leave, the other is tied by blood, block, and history. T. Roy never lived to see Von's biggest records. He was killed on Valentine's Day 2017, shot in a South Side store at only 23 years old. Von was still locked up on the Stuckey case when the news reached him. Later, he would describe breaking down in jail, grown men holding him up while he cried for his right-hand man. Here's the hidden angle most people miss. T. Roy's death did not erase the fear. It fed it. After he was gone, the stories only grew. People who knew the block kept talking about what he had been capable of. Every time Von's name came up in later years, the old association traveled with it. The short shooter who used to move beside him became part of the myth that surrounded the rapper. Even in death, T. Roy's reputation worked like an invisible second shadow. That is the rule the streets understand better than the industry ever will. You are not only judged by what you have done, you are judged by who is willing to stand next to you when the cameras were off. And for a long time, the person standing next to King Von was a 5'1" kid from Block that the city had already decided was not to be taken lightly. Chapter 3. Twitter as a battlefield diary. Most street reputations live in whispers. King Von put his on the timeline. Starting around 2012, while the rest of Chicago's drill generation was still figuring out how loud they wanted to be, Dayvon Bennett was already treating Twitter like an open logbook. After certain nights, certain names, certain funerals, posts would appear that felt too specific to ignore. References to police stops, jabs at rival blocks, casual lines about t-shirts being made for someone who had just been killed. The tone was rarely dramatic. It was almost casual, the way a person might update friends about a long day. Except the subject matter was bodies and blocks and consequences. That is what separated him from the usual tough guy performance. Street rumors can be denied. A story told in a basement can be laughed off as exaggeration. But when the same person, who is later signed to a major label, has already left a digital trail that lines up with dates, names, and police activity, the conversation changes. Other rappers did not only hear that King Von was dangerous, they could scroll back and see the attitude in real time. The fear was no longer abstract, it was archived. Years later, internet investigators did what the industry preferred not to do. They laid the tweets next to the lyrics, next to the old news reports, next to the court documents that had become public. The result was not a courtroom verdict. It was something almost more unsettling for people inside the culture, a pattern that was hard to unsee. One post after a funeral, another after a shooting, a third that seemed to answer a rival's claim. The timeline started looking less like random aggression and more like a running commentary. And that is the question that still hangs over the story. How many artists would still move the same way if every impulsive late-night thought had been saved, screenshotted, and matched against real events years later? Von's willingness to speak in public, even in slang, even in half-sentences, created a different kind of pressure. You could not dismiss him as someone who only talked in closed rooms. The record was already online. It is important to say this clearly. A tweet is not a conviction. Matching a post to a date is not the same as a jury finding. Much of what circulates is interpretation, reconstruction, and community storytelling. But in the world of drill, perception often travels faster than proof. And the perception that formed around King Von was simple and heavy. He did not only live the stories. He left receipts in plain sight. For other rappers watching from a distance, That was the part that made the reputation feel different. You could avoid certain blocks, you could stay off certain sides of the city. But once a man has already written the chapter in public, the fear stops being about what he might do next. It becomes about what he has already been willing to say out loud, and how little he seemed to care who was reading. There is a number that keeps surfacing whenever the conversation about King Von turns serious. 3. Certain older street documentaries and breakdown videos claim that federal attention, or stronger documentation, exists around 3 specific incidents tied to his name. The wider drill internet, less concerned with courtroom language, pushes the count higher, 6, 7, sometimes more, using tweets, lyrics, timelines, and block testimony. The gap between those numbers is where the entire argument lives. One side demands indictments and guilty verdicts. The other side treats the pattern itself as proof. Then the heaviest word enters the chat. Charleston White stated it without softening the edges. Under the FBI's broad definition, 3 or more killings can place a person in serial killer territory. He was not issuing a legal ruling. He was making a cultural and moral claim. And that claim split the audience in half. To those who already moved carefully around Von's name, the label felt accurate. To fans who saw only the artist, it felt like an unfair attack on a man who had simply survived a harder environment than most. 2 completely different realities occupied the same name at the same time. People who claimed to know the streets called him Death. Others went further and called him one of Satan's soldiers. Supporters kept insisting he was first and foremost a storyteller, the voice behind Crazy Story, the one who turned Chicago's chaos into vivid, almost cinematic records. That contradiction never resolved. It only grew louder. The fear around King Von was never just about a body count that could be proven in court. It was about the collision between what the streets whispered, what the timeline seemed to show, and what the music turned into entertainment. One version of him lived in the mouths of people who said they had seen the real thing. The other version lived in the playlists of fans who only ever met the artist. Both versions used the same name, and that is what made the reputation so difficult to dismiss. Chapter 5. The Ones Who Lived and the Machine That Outlived Him. Fear becomes real when the people who walked away still sound different years later. Alexander Weatherspoon is one of the names that surfaces when the conversation turns to Atlanta in 2019. He was shot. He lived. In the public record and the street retellings that followed, his survival became another data point in the growing legend around King Von and the circle that moved with him. Weatherspoon did not become a headline the way the dead did. He became something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. A living reminder that certain encounters left marks that statistics could not capture. Other voices filtered out through long interviews. On platforms like DJ Vlad, people who had been close to the old Chicago conflicts, including accounts connected to FBG.But, described earlier confrontations in language that went beyond normal street toughness. One recurring thread involved a train incident years earlier and a woman known as K.I. The details shift depending on who is speaking, but the emotional temperature stays the same. Men who claimed to have come out on the other side of those moments still spoke as if they had brushed against something that did not feel ordinary. One survivor framing, repeated in different forms across interviews, carried the same heavy implication. Even when you lived, the memory felt less like winning a fight and more like escaping something that should not have been human. That is the texture that turned rumor into reputation. It is one thing to hear that a rapper has a body count in the streets. It is another thing to watch grown men, years later, still lower their voices or change their expression when the name comes up. The fear was no longer theoretical. It had witnesses. Then the money arrived, and the fear changed shape. Once King Von's career took off, the old logic of the blocks did not fade. It scaled. Stories began circulating that the people around him, O-Block, the wider only, the family orbit, were willing to put real resources behind unfinished business. The most public and devastating example became the 2020 killing of FBG Duck on Chicago's Gold Coast. Duck had been a longtime rival voice, and the tension between the sides had played out in music and social media for years. When he was shot down in broad daylight in a wealthy part of the city, the case did not die with the headlines. Multiple people were later arrested and charged. Federal and local investigators built a picture of coordination, money, and motive that did not require King Von to still be alive. The machine had already moved. That detail mattered more than most casual fans understood. Other rappers watching from a distance were not only measuring themselves against one man with a dark reputation, they were measuring themselves against a network that could still operate after the central figure was gone. Prosecutors did not need Von's testimony or his presence. The name itself had become a cause that people were willing to act on. In the logic of the streets and the industry that fed on those streets, that is a different level of danger. A single shooter can be avoided. A structure that keeps score after the funeral is harder to outrun. Even symbolic disrespect carried weight. After Von was killed in Atlanta, the protection around his memory did not relax. When FBG Cash was perceived as crossing lines, whether around murals, online comments, or the general tone of disrespect toward the dead, the response from Lil Durk's side was not subtle. Public messages went out that read like warnings. The implication was clear. The name still had people standing behind it. The name still had consequences. In a culture where posthumous disrespect is common and often profitable, the fact that certain lines still felt dangerous said everything about how deep the fear had settled. This is the chapter that explains why the caution around King Von never fully became nostalgia. While he was alive, the fear was personal. The tweets, the stories, the survivors who spoke in haunted tones, the understanding that he moved with people who already had their own reputations. After he was gone, the fear became structural. It was no longer only about what one man might do in a parking lot at 3 a.m. It was about the money that could still move, the loyalty that did not expire, and the quiet knowledge that insulting the wrong memory might still draw a real-world response. Most rap beefs die with the artist or fade into old YouTube comments. This one left behind a machine. And that is why, even now, some rappers still measure their words when the conversation turns to Block, to Von, and to the years when the streets and the timeline seem to be writing the same story in real time. The man is gone. The residue of the fear he helped create and the network that kept his name active is what continues to make the room quieter when certain stories get told. Chapter 6. The Night in Atlanta. The last full day of King Von's life began with an interview that now feels like a warning no one heard. On November 5, 2020, he sat with DJ Academics and talked about the tension floating around his name, the online noise connecting him to NBA YoungBoy, the rumors, the social media shots. Von downplayed it. He said it was not that serious. The internet made everything look bigger than it was. By the end of the conversation, he sounded like a man who believed he still had time to manage the narrative. Less than 24 hours later, the narrative ended in a parking lot. In the early morning hours of November 6th, outside the Monaco Hookah Lounge in Atlanta, two groups crossed paths. One moved with King Von. The other included Quando Rondo and the people around him. What started as recognition turned into a physical confrontation. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of words and movements, but the core fact is not in dispute. Von and his side engaged. Fists and bodies collided in the chaotic space between cars and streetlights. Then the guns came out. Timothy Lul Tim Leaks, close to Quando, opened fire. Multiple people were hit. King Von was among them. He was 26 years old. He was rushed from the scene but did not survive the night. Another man from his circle also died. Others, including people on both sides and at least one of Von's associates, were wounded. Off-duty officers working security became involved as the shooting spread. The parking lot that should have been just another late-night industry overlap became a crime scene that would redefine several careers and several beefs at once. In the days and years that followed, people who were there tried to explain the unexplainable. One of the most repeated lines came from voices close to Von's camp, including accounts connected to Block Louie and others who survived the night. The essence was always the same. King Von was his own man. If he decided to move on a situation, there was no talking him out of it. Security could advise, friends could try to pull him back. None of it mattered once his mind was set. That trait, the same refusal to let things slide that had built his reputation in Chicago, became the trait that closed the story in Atlanta. Here's the twist that still sits heavy over the entire legend. The man the rap game feared most did not fall because an opponent outsmarted him in some long strategic war. He fell in a sudden, messy, preventable parking lot confrontation that escalated in seconds. The fear he inspired was real. The network around him was real. The bodies and the tweets and the survivor stories were all part of a reputation that made other artists change their plans. And yet, on the night it ended, The danger did not come from a calculated hit or a carefully laid trap. It came from the same impulse that had defined him, the decision not to walk away. Quando Rondo later described the moment he was struck as an out-of-body experience. Lul Team would eventually speak about acting to protect his friend. Von's own people kept returning to the same hard truth. Once he locked in, no one could pull him back. The interview with academics from the day before, where he said the tension was nothing to worry about, now plays like the final miscalculation. The streets had spent years teaching everyone to be afraid of King Von. That night proved the fear was based on something real. It also proved that the same fire that made him feared could not be controlled, not by rivals, not by friends, and not even by the version of himself that had just told the world it was not that serious. By sunrise on November 6, 2020, the most dangerous reputation in drill had become a memorial. Death usually softens a reputation. King Von's did the opposite. After the shooting in Atlanta, the image that spread fastest was not a memorial soft focus photo. It was the cold, direct stare from the Demon video. Black and white, unblinking, already half turned into a meme. The internet took that face and turned it into a reaction image for pure menace. What began as a posthumous music video frame became visual shorthand for a threat that no longer needed a living body. The stare itself started doing the work. In the years that followed, the caution around his name did not relax. Rappers who had no problem trading shots with the living suddenly measured their words when the conversation turned to O-Block or to Von. Open, reckless disrespect became rare. Some of that was respect for the dead, some of it was simple calculation. The network that had moved while he was alive had already shown it could keep moving after the funeral. The machine did not require his physical presence, it only required the name to still carry weight. That is the final layer of the fear. They were never only afraid of a song. They were afraid of the man who had turned real violence into a public timeline, who left enough digital and street residue that strangers on the internet could later reconstruct entire chapters, and who somehow converted that residue into a brand no one wanted to test lightly. Even after he was gone, the combination of the music, the old tweets, the survivor stories, and the people still willing to answer for the name created a quiet zone around certain conversations. King Von made drill feel like documentary. That is why the records hit so hard. That is also why the room still changes temperature when the stories get told. Was the fear built by the streets that raised him? The tweets he refused to delete? Or the people who kept the name dangerous long after the body was in the ground? Drop your answer in the comments. Who do you think was actually scared? And who was only performing fear for the camera? This was the real story of why rappers were scared of King Von.